The moving truck was already backed into the driveway when I pulled up, and my mother-in-law was standing on the porch directing two men to carry my recliner out to the curb like it was garbage. "Rebecca, what is this?" I asked, stepping out of my truck, my voice shaking in a way I hated. "You don't own anything here, Daniel," she said, not even looking at me, her arms crossed over her cardigan. "This was always Whitfield property, and now that Robert's gone, it's time you understood that. 12 years. 12 years I'd lived on that farm, worked that land, buried my own father-in-law 2 weeks earlier with my own hands helping carry the casket, and now I was standing in the driveway watching strangers carry my life out onto the grass. "Where's Sarah?" I asked, and something in Rebecca's face flickered. "Just for a second, guilt maybe, or something close to it." "She agrees with me," Rebecca said. "This is what's best for everyone." I didn't believe that for 1 second. Not about my wife, not about the woman I'd married 11 years earlier in that same backyard under a string of lights her father had put up himself, and that disbelief was the only thing that kept me from getting back in my truck and driving away for good that afternoon. Instead, I walked past her into the house, past the movers, straight to the small home office where Robert used to keep his files, because some instinct deep in my gut told me the answer to what was really happening here wasn't in that driveway at all, it was in that room. To understand how I ended up standing in that driveway watching my own furniture get thrown onto the lawn, you have to go back almost 13 years, to a diner outside a small town in central Ohio where I first met Sarah Whitfield over a cup of bad coffee and a job interview that changed my whole life. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 38 years old, and back then I was a 25-year-old kid from 3 states away with nothing but a pickup truck, a farm equipment repair certificate, and a work ethic I'd learned the hard way growing up with a single mother who cleaned houses for a living. Sarah was working the counter at that diner to help pay for community college, and I liked her before she ever said a single word to me, just from the way she handled a difficult customer with more patience than I had in my whole body. We got married 2 years later in her family's backyard, and her father Robert, a big, quiet man who ran a 200-acre farm and a small equipment repair shop on the side, looked me dead in the eye at the reception and told me he expected me to work harder than anyone else on that land because that's what family meant to him. I did exactly that for 12 years. I poured myself into that farm and that shop, fixing tractors at midnight during harvest season, taking over the books when Robert's eyesight started failing, building the repair business into something that brought in more steady income than the farming ever had. Robert's wife, Rebecca, never fully warmed to me the way he did. She was polite at holidays, cool at everything else, the kind of polite that always felt like it had an expiration date attached to it. Their son, my brother-in-law Kyle, was a different story entirely. Kyle was 2 years older than Sarah, charming in the kind of way that made people forgive him things they shouldn't, and from the very beginning, he treated me like hired help who happened to marry into the family by accident. "You're good with your hands, I'll give you that," Kyle told me once, early on, at a 4th of July barbecue, in a tone that somehow made it sound like an insult instead of a compliment. I let it roll off me for years, because Robert never treated me that way, and Robert was the one whose opinion actually mattered on that land. About 5 years ago, Robert started slowing down, his hands shaking too much to work on engines anymore, his breath getting short walking across the shop floor, and I quietly stepped into more and more of his responsibilities without either of us ever making it official. Those years taught me more about the man than the previous 7 combined. I learned he kept a small photo of his own father, a man he rarely mentioned, tucked into the visor of his truck, and that he still teared up every single year on the anniversary of losing him, quiet and private and never once mentioning it out loud. I learned he distrusted banks more than he ever let on, a habit left over from watching his own family nearly lose their land during a bad stretch in the 80s, and that distrust, I'd later understand, explained more about his final decisions than almost anything else about him. He started talking to me differently around that time too, taking me on long, slow walks around the property, telling me stories about how he built the repair shop from a single rented garage bay, telling me things I don't think he ever told Kyle, because Kyle had never once asked. "This place doesn't run itself, Danny," he told me one evening, sitting on the tailgate of his old truck. "It runs because somebody cares enough to keep showing up. You've shown up every single day for years. Don't think I haven't noticed that." I told him I was just doing what family does, And he laughed, a tired, knowing laugh, and told me family was supposed to work that way, but it rarely actually did. 2 years ago, Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and everything about our lives changed almost overnight, the slow decline turning suddenly, brutally fast in a way none of us were prepared for. No matter how much the doctors tried to warn us, I remember the night he called me alone into his office, just the two of us, Sarah, out picking up his prescriptions, and he slid a manila envelope across the desk toward me without a word. "I need you to hold on to this," he said. "Don't open it yet, just keep it somewhere safe, somewhere Rebecca and Kyle wouldn't think to look." I asked him what was inside it, and he just shook his head slowly, his eyes tired in a way I'd never seen before. "Some things I need to make right before I'm gone," he said. "Some things I should have made right a long time ago. You'll understand when the time comes. Danny, I just need you to trust me a little longer." I trusted him. I always had. I took that envelope home and put it in the bottom drawer of my toolbox in the shop, underneath a layer of old receipts. And I never once looked inside it, exactly like he asked, even as the months went on and his condition worsened by the week. A few weeks after that, Robert asked me to drive him into town for what he told Rebecca was a routine oncology follow-up, but instead directed me to a small law office 2 blocks off Main Street, a place I'd never heard him mention before. He was inside for almost an hour while I waited in the truck, and when he came back out, he was quieter than usual, staring out the windshield for a long moment before telling me to just drive, without offering any explanation at all. "Some things a man has to handle himself," he said eventually. When I finally asked, "You'll understand soon enough, Danny." I promise you that I didn't push him on it, though the memory of that quiet law office would come back to me later, sharper and more meaningful than I could have understood at the time. Robert passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with Sarah holding one hand and Rebecca holding the other, and I was standing in the doorway of that hospital room, feeling like an outsider in a moment that should have belonged to all of us equally. There was a moment, just before the machines finally went quiet, when Robert's eyes found mine across the room, and he gave me the smallest nod, barely noticeable to anyone else watching, but unmistakable to me. I've replayed that nod in my head more times than I can count since then, trying to decide exactly what he meant by it. The funeral was hard, the kind of hard that doesn't fully hit you until weeks later, when the casseroles stop coming and the house goes quiet and you're left with just the shape of the person who used to fill it. I didn't think much about the envelope in those first 2 weeks. Grief has a way of making even the most important things feel distant and unreal, like they're happening to someone else on the other side of a pane of glass. It was Rebecca who broke that fog, less than 14 days after we buried her husband, when she called a family meeting at the kitchen table and told Sarah, Kyle, and me that some decisions needed to be made about the property going forward. "Robert's will is straightforward," she said, sliding a thin document across the table. "The farm, the shop, all of it goes into the family trust, managed by myself and Kyle. Sarah, you're a beneficiary, of course. Daniel, you're not listed anywhere in this, since you're not blood family." The words landed like a slap, even though some quiet part of me had feared exactly this moment for longer than I wanted to admit. "I've worked that shop for 12 years, I said, keeping my voice level with everything I had. "I built half the client list it has now. And you'll be compensated fairly for your labor going forward, as an employee, if Kyle decides to keep you on," Rebecca said, like she was doing me a favor. "But this is Whitfield land, Daniel. It was always going to stay that way." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, anything, and instead she just stared down at her hands, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted, and said nothing at all. That silence hurt more than anything Rebecca had said, more than I think I let myself admit even to myself in that moment. Kyle, for his part, could barely hide the satisfaction on his face, the kind of look a man gets when he's finally about to collect on something he's felt entitled to his whole life. "Nothing personal, man," he told me afterward, in the driveway, like those 3 words could soften 12 years being erased in a single conversation. "Business is business. You understand." I didn't say anything back to him. I got in my truck and drove straight to the shop, and I sat there alone in the dark for almost 2 hours before I remembered the envelope sitting in the bottom of my toolbox. I want to be honest with you here, because these stories only mean something if we're honest about the messy parts. In that moment, sitting alone in a shop I'd built with my own two hands, I wasn't thinking about revenge yet. I was thinking about whether I even had a life left here at all. I finally opened that drawer with hands that weren't quite steady, moved aside the layer of old receipts, and pulled out the envelope Robert had given me nearly 2 years earlier. My phone buzzed in my pocket right as I picked it up, a text from Sarah asking where I'd gone, followed almost immediately by a second message that made my chest tighten. Mom's already talking to a realtor about the shop property. Please call me. I set the phone face down on the workbench without answering, because whatever was inside that envelope suddenly felt more urgent than it had even 10 minutes earlier. Inside was a single folded document, notarized, dated almost 18 months before his death, and as I read the first paragraph, my breath caught somewhere in the back of my throat. It was a deed, a legal transfer of a 40-acre parcel of the property, the exact 40 acres the repair shop and equipment yard sat on, out of Robert's personal holdings and into a separate, private trust listing to names as co-trustees, Sarah's name and mine. I read it 3 times before I let myself believe what I was seeing, because it changed absolutely everything about what Rebecca had told me at that kitchen table. Robert hadn't just left the farmhouse and the main acreage in the family trust with Rebecca and Kyle. He'd quietly, separately, carved out the shop and its land into something entirely different, something Rebecca clearly didn't even know existed, and he'd put my name on it right alongside his own daughter's. There was a short handwritten letter folded inside the same envelope, and I sat there in the dark shop reading his familiar, shaky handwriting like it was a voice reaching out to me from somewhere I couldn't follow him anymore. Danny, it read, I know Rebecca and Kyle will try to push you out the second I'm gone. I've watched it happening slowly for years and I let it happen too long out of my own weakness. This is my way of making it right. The shop is yours and Sarah's, free and clear, filed and recorded. Whether Rebecca wants to believe it or not, don't let them shame you out of what you earned. You earned every inch of it. I'm sorry it took me dying to finally say so. I sat in that dark shop and cried for the first time since the funeral, not from grief this time, but from something more complicated, something closer to being seen, finally, by a man who could no longer say it to my face, but sitting there with that deed in my hands. I also had a harder question to face, one that scared me more than Rebecca's cold dismissal ever had. Why hadn't Sarah known anything about this? And why, at that kitchen table, had she said absolutely nothing to defend me at all? I didn't sleep that night. I sat up going through every filing cabinet in that office, every drawer, every folder, trying to understand exactly what Robert had built here and why he'd kept it so carefully hidden from the rest of his own family. What I found only deepened the mystery instead of solving it. Buried in an old bank statement folder was a separate account, opened around the same time as the deed, funded steadily over 18 months with small, careful transfers that never once appeared on the family's shared farm accounting. The balance on that account, as of the last statement 3 months before Robert's death, was just under $210,000. Tucked behind the last statement was something else entirely, a folded printout of an email exchange between Robert and Patricia's office from over a year earlier, the subject line reading, simply protecting D&S, and my hands went still on the paper as I realized just how long he'd been planning this. I sat back in that chair feeling like the floor had shifted underneath me all over again, because whatever Robert had been quietly building in those final 2 years, it was clearly bigger and more deliberate than a simple gesture of gratitude toward a son-in-law he respected. The next morning, I called an attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alonso who'd handled some of the shop's business contracts over the years, and I laid the deed out on her desk with hands that still weren't entirely steady. She read it carefully, twice, adjusting her glasses, before she finally looked up at me. This is airtight, Daniel, she said. It's recorded with the county, properly notarized, completely separate from the main family trust. Legally, you and your wife own this parcel outright, regardless of what your mother-in-law believes or what the will says about the rest of the property. Then why didn't Robert just tell everyone this while he was alive? I asked, the question that had been eating at me all night. Patricia leaned back in her chair, Considering it carefully, sometimes people wait because they're not ready for the conflict it'll cause while they're still around to see it happen. Sometimes they wait because they're protecting someone. I can't tell you which one this is, but I can tell you this document is real, and it's yours. She slid one more page across the desk toward me, a note she'd pulled from her own file, something Robert had apparently dictated to her office assistant during that final visit but never signed himself. He mentioned wanting a second meeting to explain some of this to his daughter directly. Patricia said he never made it in for that appointment. I think he ran out of time before he was ready. That detail sat with me the whole drive home. The idea that Robert had been racing against his own body to finish something he never quite got to complete, and that whatever answers were still missing, I was going to have to find them myself. I left her office that day with more questions than I'd walked in with, and one of them kept circling back louder than all the others. What exactly had Robert been protecting Sarah and me from? And why had he needed almost $200,000 quietly set aside to do it? That question got partially answered 3 days later, in a way I never saw coming, when Sarah finally showed up at the small apartment I'd rented above the hardware store in town, the place I'd been staying since Rebecca had my things carried out onto the lawn. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she spoke, her eyes red, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I nodded, bracing myself, though for what exactly, I still didn't know. "My dad talked to me about the deed," she said, "almost 2 years ago, before he ever gave you that envelope." My stomach dropped. "You knew about this the whole time?" "Not exactly," she said quickly. "He told me he was setting something up to protect you, to protect us. But he never told me the details, and he made me promise not to say anything until it mattered. He said if my mother found out too early, she'd fight it in court before he even passed, and it would tear the family apart while he was still alive to see it happen." "So you sat at that table and said nothing?" I said, the hurt in my voice impossible to hide anymore, knowing this was coming. "I didn't know if you'd even found the envelope yet," she said, tears sliding down her face now. "I didn't know if he'd told you what it was, or if he'd changed his mind at the end, or if my mother had somehow found a way around it." I was terrified of hoping for something that might not even be real anymore. I sat with that for a long moment, the anger and the understanding wrestling with each other in my chest, because I could see, even through my own hurt, that she'd been carrying an impossible weight for 2 years, caught between a dying father's secret and a mother who would have burned the whole family down rather than share an inch of that land with me. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, and something in her voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "That account he set up, I think I know part of why it's there, and I think my mother might already know more about it than she's letting on." I felt my whole body go still, bracing for whatever was coming next, because Sarah rarely spoke that carefully unless she was working her way towards something that scared her. "When did you figure this out?" I asked. "Piece by piece," she said, "over the last few months, watching Mom and Kyle handle things after the diagnosis, little comments here and there that didn't add up until I really started paying attention." "Be honest, if you found out your own spouse had been sitting on a secret that big for 2 years, even for understandable reasons, would you have been able to forgive that as easily as I did?" "I'd genuinely like to hear where you draw that line in the comments below," Sarah explained, haltingly, piecing it together the way you do when you're finally allowing yourself to say something you've avoided admitting even to yourself. A little over 2 years ago, before his diagnosis, Robert had discovered that Kyle had been quietly siphoning money from the shop's parts accounts, small amounts at first, invoices padded here, supplier discounts pocketed there, adding up over almost 3 years to just under $60,000. Robert never reported it to the police. Instead, according to Sarah, he'd confronted Kyle privately, forced him to start paying restitution through reduced draws from the family accounts, and told him if he ever did it again, he'd cut him out of everything without a second thought. "That's part of what that separate account was," Sarah said. "Dad started setting aside money quietly, almost like he didn't fully trust the family trust to stay honest long term, especially with Mom in charge of it alongside Kyle. He wanted something clean, something separate, something nobody could touch or manipulate." I sat back, letting that settle over me, the picture of Robert I thought I knew shifting into something more complicated. A man who'd spent his final years quietly trying to protect the people he loved from the people he also loved, in the only way he knew how. Does Kyle know you know? I asked. Sarah shook her head. No, and I mean Daniel, she caught herself. I don't think my mother fully knows about the embezzlement either. I think Dad kept that from her too, to protect Kyle's reputation, or maybe just to keep the peace while he still could. That detail sat heavy in the room between us, because it meant Rebecca genuinely believed, in her own mind, that she was protecting the family's legacy from an outsider, when in reality, the real threat to that legacy had been living under her own roof the entire time. I asked Sarah one more question that night, the one that had been sitting heaviest on my chest since she walked through the door. Did your dad know you'd figured all this out? About Kyle, about the account, about all of it? She nodded slowly. About a month before he passed, I confronted him about some inconsistencies in the shop's books, and he finally told me everything. Made me promise to let him handle it his own way, in his own time, and you kept that promise even after he was gone, I said. Not quite a question. I didn't know how else to honor him, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I thought protecting his plan meant staying quiet a little longer, even when it was costing you everything. I see now how wrong that was. I asked her, gently, why she thought her father had chosen me specifically to hold on to that envelope, instead of simply leaving instructions with Patricia or filing it somewhere Rebecca might eventually find on her own. Because he trusted you not to open it before it was time, she said. He used to say that about you a lot. Actually, that you were the only person in this family who never once tried to take something before it was rightfully yours. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere quiet and permanent in my chest, because it was, in its own way, the truest thing anyone had ever said about who I actually was underneath everything else. I reached over and took her hand, because whatever anger I still carried, I understood now that we'd both been carrying pieces of the same impossible secret, just from opposite ends of it. 2 weeks later, I decided it was time to go back to that house, not to fight, but to finally lay every piece of what I'd learned out on that same kitchen table where Rebecca had once told me I wasn't blood family and therefore didn't matter. I brought Patricia with me this time, along with a folder of copies, the recorded deed, the bank statements, and a summary Patricia had prepared explaining exactly what Robert's separate trust legally meant for the shop's ownership going forward. Rebecca answered the door, already annoyed or clearly expecting some kind of confrontation, and Kyle was sitting at the kitchen table when we walked in, arms crossed, that same easy confidence still sitting comfortably on his face. I don't know what kind of lawyer theatrics you're planning, Rebecca said, but this conversation is already over. Daniel, the will is the will. This isn't about the will, I said, setting the folder down on the table. It's about a separate deed your husband recorded 18 months before he passed, transferring the shop and its 40 acres into a private trust with Sarah and me as co-owners. Rebecca's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally something colder, more controlled. That's impossible, she said. Robert would have told me something that's significant. He didn't tell you a lot of things, apparently, I said, and I slid the second folder across the table, the one with the bank records and Patricia's brief summary of the embezzlement Robert had quietly uncovered years earlier. Kyle's confident posture cracked the instant he saw the account numbers, his eyes darting up to meet mine, then to his mother's, then back down to the table, like a man watching his own careful architecture collapse in real time. What is this? Rebecca said slowly, picking up the pages, though something in her voice told me she already suspected exactly what it was. Ask your son, I said quietly. Ask him about the parts invoices from 3 years ago. Ask him why your husband was quietly setting aside almost $200,000 separate from the family accounts in his final 2 years alive. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in that kitchen, heavier even than the silence from the day I was told I wasn't family at all. Mom, I can explain, Kyle started, but Rebecca held up a hand without even looking at him, her eyes still fixed on the bank statement in front of her. How much? She said, her voice flat and dangerous. It doesn't matter now, Kyle said, and that, more than anything else he could have said, had told both of us it mattered a great deal. Rebecca finally looked up, First at her son, with an expression I can only describe as a lifetime of assumptions crumbling all at once, and then at me, and for the first time in 11 years, I watched something shift behind her eyes that looked almost like shame. How long, she asked Kyle quietly, has this been going on? It started small, Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper now, all the confidence gone out of it completely. I told myself I'd pay it back before anyone noticed, then it just kept getting bigger, and I didn't know how to stop it without everyone finding out. Your father knew, Rebecca said, not quite believing her own words even as she said them. He knew. And he never told me. He was trying to protect this family, I said. And I meant it, even though some part of me still felt the sting of everything that protection had cost me personally in his own flawed, complicated way. I don't think he got it perfectly right, but I don't think he was wrong to try. You knew about this, she said to Sarah. You had been standing quietly by the doorway through all of it. Your father told you, and you never said anything to me. He asked me not to, Sarah said softly. He was trying to protect this family from falling apart before he even had the chance to leave it in better shape than he found it. Rebecca sat down slowly at the table, the same table where she'd once dismissed 12 years of my life in under a minute, and for a long moment she simply stared at the papers in front of her without speaking at all. I need some time, she finally said, her voice hollow. I need to sit with this before I say anything else I might regret. Sarah walked her mother to the door that afternoon, the two of them exchanging a brief, wordless hug before Rebecca climbed into her car and drove off slower than usual, like a woman carrying something heavier than she was used to. We left her there that afternoon, sitting alone at that kitchen table with the truth spread out in front of her, and I remember feeling, driving away, something closer to grief than victory, watching a woman's entire understanding of her own family come apart in a single conversation. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because these stories are more interesting when they're true to how people actually behave. I didn't feel triumphant sitting in that kitchen. I felt tired and sad, watching a family slowly discover just how much they'd never actually known about each other. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been quietly protecting you from a truth you weren't ready to hear yet? I'd really love to hear your story in the comments, because I think most families are carrying something like this, whether they realize it yet or not. Over the following weeks, the fallout moved slowly, the way real consequences usually do. Nothing like the fast, satisfying resolution you'd see in a movie. Rebecca, to her credit once the shock wore off, didn't try to fight the deed. Once Patricia confirmed its legitimacy with the county records legally, there was nothing left to contest. Kyle's situation was more complicated. Rebecca gave him a choice, quietly, privately, away from Sarah and me. Either pay back what remained of the embezzled funds through a structured plan she'd oversee personally, or she would report the matter to the authorities herself, regardless of what it did to the family's reputation in town. He chose to pay it back. It took him the better part of a year, working a second job at a farm supply store the town's over, something I never once saw him do voluntarily in all the years I'd known him. I ran into him there once by accident, restocking fence posts on a Saturday morning, and instead of the easy, dismissive charm he used to greet me with, he just nodded, quiet and a little embarrassed, and asked how the shop was running these days. Busy. I told him, good, busy, good, he said, and for a second it looked like he wanted to say something more, maybe an apology, maybe just an acknowledgement of everything that had happened, but he just nodded again and went back to stacking posts, and I let him have that silence instead of pushing for more. I didn't gloat about any of it. Not to Kyle, not to Rebecca, not even privately to myself. In the quiet moments when the old hurt still crept back in uninvited, I'd learned enough from Robert's own quiet example to know that the kind of justice worth having wasn't the kind you celebrated loudly, it was the kind that simply let the truth finally stand on its own. Sarah and I moved back onto the 40 acres about 6 weeks after that kitchen table conversation. Once Patricia had finished formally transferring the shop's operating accounts into our names alone, separate and clean from anything connected to the family trust, moving back in felt strange in ways I hadn't expected. Walking through rooms that still smelled faintly of Robert's aftershave, finding his handwriting on old invoices tucked in drawers I hadn't cleared out yet, small reminders of him scattered through a space that now legally belonged to us in a way it never officially had before. Sarah struggled more than I did in those first few weeks, waking some nights convinced she'd heard her father's truck pulling into the driveway, only to remember, over and over, that he wasn't coming back. I held her through most of those nights without saying much of anything, because some grief just needs a quiet witness instead of words. Built inside those four walls for over a decade, he was right about you, she said quietly, almost to herself. I just wasn't ready to hear it while he was still around to say it. I owe you an apology, she said, not quite meeting my eyes, not just for the driveway, for 11 years of treating you like you were only ever passing through this family instead of actually part of it. I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't. Not entirely, not yet, but I told her I appreciated her saying it, and that felt like enough of a start for both of us. Over the months that followed, Rebecca started showing up more often, small visits at first, dropping off vegetables from her garden, staying for coffee instead of rushing off the way she used to, slowly rebuilding something between us that resembled, if not closeness exactly, then something honest enough to build on. Thanksgiving came around 8 months after Robert's death, the first real holiday gathering since everything had unfolded, and Sarah and I hosted it ourselves, in the farmhouse kitchen at the same table where so much of this story had come apart and slowly, carefully, come back together again. We set an extra place at the table that day, quietly, without discussing it beforehand, both of us reaching for the same instinct at the same time, a small empty setting where Robert used to sit, not out of sadness exactly, but as a way of making sure his presence still had a seat at the table he'd spent his whole life building. Kyle showed up quieter than I'd ever seen him, helping carry chairs in from the garage without being asked, an ordinary gesture that would have meant nothing from anyone else, but from him felt like its own small kind of apology. Rebecca sat at the head of the table where Robert used to sit, and before we ate, she surprised all of us by asking if she could say something first. Robert built this family on hard work and quiet loyalty, she said, her voice unsteady. For too long I let myself believe that loyalty only counted if it came with the right last name attached to it. I was wrong about that, and I'm grateful I still have time to be better about it. I looked over at Sarah, who reached under the table and found my hand without either of us needing to say anything at all. Kyle raised his glass a little later that evening, awkward and unpracticed at this kind of thing, and offered a short, halting toast to his father, thanking him for teaching all of them, in his own quiet way, what actually mattered in the end. It wasn't a grand speech, it didn't need to be. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the most weight, especially from people who spent years never offering them at all. I still think about that manila envelope sometimes, sitting quietly under a layer of old receipts for almost 2 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to change everything. I think about how easily I could have missed it, how easily this whole story could have ended with me simply driving away from that driveway and never looking back. Some nights, working late in the shop the way I always used to, I catch myself talking to Robert the way I did when he was still alive, telling him about a repair job, a new client, some small piece of news I know he would have wanted to hear, and for a moment it doesn't feel foolish at all, it just feels like keeping a promise. I'm grateful I didn't drive away that day, not because of the land, or the shop, or even the money Robert quietly protected for us in that separate account, though all of that certainly mattered in ways I won't pretend it didn't. I'm grateful because somewhere in the middle of losing a man I respected more than almost anyone in my life, I found proof, real, undeniable, legally recorded proof, that he'd seen exactly who I was the whole time, even when the rest of his family couldn't, or wouldn't, see it themselves. A year after that Thanksgiving, Sarah and I hung a small photo of Robert in the shop office, right above the desk where I do the books now, standing next to his old truck with that same knowing half smile he always wore when he thought nobody was paying attention. Every morning I unlock that shop door, I glance up at that photo before I turn the lights on, and every morning, in some quiet, private way, I still say thank you. 12 years of proving myself, 2 years of silence, and one folded piece of paper hidden under old receipts. That's what it took for the truth to finally find its way to the surface, and I wouldn't trade a single hard mile of that road for an easier version of how it all turned out. If you made it this far with me, I want to say thank you, genuinely, for sticking with this story all the way through, because stories like this only really matter when someone's actually listening on the other end of them. If this one hit home for you in any way, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the Revenge Diaries so you never miss the next story, and if you know somebody who'd understand exactly what this one was really about underneath it all, send it their way, because sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the moment they need it most. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, stick around, because there's another story waiting for you right after this one. Another family, another quiet betrayal, another patient, hard-earned kind of justice, and trust me, you're going to want to see exactly how that one unfolds too.